Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Revolution 250 podcast. I am Bob Allison. I chair the Rev 250 advisory group, and I also teach history at Suffolk University. And Rev 250, as I hope you know, is a consortium of more than 70 groups in and around Massachusetts looking at ways to commemorate the American Revolution. And today I'm going to talk about probably one of the best known women of the American Revolution, although I have to say, we don't know a whole lot about her. And hers is probably the best known story, or one of the best known stories of the Revolution, but we're not sure how much of it is true. This is the story of Jane McCrea. And Jane McCrea died tragically on the New York frontier in 1777 under mysterious circumstances which have become the stuff of legend. I'll tell you what we know about her, or what we think we know about the story. I'm always puzzled. Should we begin with what we absolutely know, or with the story which people knew in the 19th century and even in the late 18th century about Jane McCrea, her tragic story? Or I could begin with what we do know about her, which then may be the fairly mundane story up to the moment of her death. So, the story, as we think we know it, is this. Jane McCrea, a young woman in what's now upstate New York, was betrothed or engaged to a young man. Both of them had grown up in New Jersey. I'll start with the New Jersey story. Jane was born in Bedminster, New Jersey. Her father was a Presbyterian minister there. Mcrae, probably Scots-Irish. And her father, Presbyterian minister, has 5 children with his first wife, one of them Jane. He gets married again. We think she was born sometime between about 1752 and 1754, probably around 1760 or so. Her mother dies. Her father remarries, and he has a number of children with his second wife. And she, at some point in the early 1770s, so when she's about 20 years old, goes to upstate New York to live with her brother and her older brother, John. And there she is, and also in this neighborhood, and by neighborhood, I mean a pretty big geographic area, was also a young man she had known in New Jersey named David Jones. And Jones and his family had migrated up to the area along the Hudson River near what is today Fort Edward, New York. And there they were. And Jane McCrea and David Jones apparently had a relationship which was going to lead to marriage. Now, of course, the Revolution does impact a lot of things. And Jane's older brother, John, becomes part of the New York militia. He's in the Albany County militia. David Jones, her fiance, remains loyal to the crown. And sometime in 1776 or 77, Jones goes up to Canada, and he comes back in 1777 with General Burgoyne's army. I know this is all becoming very confusing as I'm talking about these guys and Jane McCrea and her fiance. Jane also, here I'll tell you another piece. It becomes kind of like a soap opera. She becomes friendly with a young woman named Polly, whose grandmother is Sarah Campbell McNeil. And Sarah McNeil had been married to a guy named Campbell, who was the grandfather of Polly. And Polly is actually engaged to a young man who is in the colonial militia. So here, Jane and Polly, best friends. One's engaged to a loyalist, the other's engaged to a patriot. You can see why this is going to be the stuff of legend, or the stuff of great stories, because we have all these conflicting family alliances. And Sarah Campbell McNeil, is a cousin of Simon Fraser, and Simon Fraser is an officer in Burgoyne's army. So Fraser and Burgoyne are coming down Lake Champlain to attack the Americans, and Jane's brother is part of the force that is going to be defending against Campbell, Fraser, and Burgoyne, and ultimately young David Jones, who is part of this force. And here we are on this New York frontier as all of this is happening. So, what is the story of Jane McCrea? Well, let me see if I can get to this. What happens to Jane McCrea? Okay, there are a couple of different stories. One is that she was contacted by her fiance after the British had taken Crown Point and were moving on to Ticonderoga, saying, "Come and join me." And he said, "Go to Fort Edward, where you'll be housed by our good friend, Sarah McNeill, and she will help get you to Canada by way of these 2 Indian scouts I am going to send." This is one of the stories. David Jones sends emissaries in the persons of these 2 Native Americans who are going to escort his fiancée up from Fort Edward to Fort Ticonderoga, where she will be married. And of course, she's going to be wearing her wedding finery. This is one of the stories. And I suspect that particular story isn't true. What seems to have happened is she left her brother's house to go to Fort Edward, possibly to visit or possibly to be under the protection of this fort. And there she was staying with the grandmother of her friend, this Sarah McNeill, and her household, which included an African-American woman who was enslaved, the African-American woman's child, along with a kind of handyman. And here, this is at the moment when Burgoyne's forces are moving into the area. His forces and others, they had taken Crown Point, they had taken Fort Ticonderoga. Fort Edward seemed to be in danger, and somewhere around the 23rd or so of July of 1777, most of the garrison from Fort Edward moved off, as did many of the people at Fort Edward, because they knew the British are coming down, along with their Native American allies. Now, Burgoyne had been careful with the Native American forces who were allied with him. He was kind of using them in 2 ways. One was he liked the Native Americans as scouts, and also liked the fact that they could inflict terror on the American frontier. On the other hand, he knew that the barbarity of war, that atrocities committed by Native Americans, scalping and looting and other things, would really backfire, would actually raise the ire of the Americans, but he wanted to raise the fear of the Americans without the ire. You can kind of see how Burgoyne is playing a difficult and ultimately tragic game here. And Burgoyne had counseled the Native Americans, saying, "You can't scalp people until they're dead, and only people you have killed," but knew the Native Americans' scalps were one of the things they sought. And one way you proved that you had actually killed someone was to produce a scalp. So you have Burgoyne warning the Native American colonists that if they don't remain loyal to the king and give up the rebellion, all kinds of consequences are going to ensue. So he issues a proclamation to the Americans saying, "You better watch out because I have the Native Americans with me and you know what's going to happen then." But he also tells the Native Americans, don't scalp and don't indiscriminately scalp people. We don't want to do that kind of thing, but you can take some scalps. Complicated story here. And I'm not quite sure what is going to happen. We know that the frontier is somewhat chaotic and fearful about what is going to happen with the onslaught of Burgoyne, and the fact that the American defenses don't seem as well prepared as they should have been or might have been. And you think about the Americans are trying to contest a very wide area. That is, Washington's forces right now are down in Pennsylvania trying to guard against the General Howe's army taking Philadelphia. And here on the northern frontier, you have Philip Schuyler being succeeded by Horatio Gates, who is going to take command of these forces, and confusing, murky, and this mysterious big British force, moving down Lake Champlain, led by Burgoyne, another force under Barry St. Leger, which has moved west and is now moving from Lake Ontario into the interior of New York. So this is where we are as we have this little story unfolding near Fort Edward on the shore near Lake George and Lake Champlain. So as I said, end of July, the last week of July when all of this happens, and you have most of the garrison at Fort Edward withdrawing so they can be closer to General Gates and his forces. A very small garrison is left. There's a blockhouse outside. And on the weekend of July 26th and 27th, I believe it is, the Native Americans raid the area. There are maybe 500, maybe 1,000 Native Americans moving through the area, mainly not from the Iroquois Confederation, but there are some who are Wyandots, and Wyandots are Iroquoian-speaking people from the area around Lake Huron. And on the Saturday of the weekend, now someone along the path had killed a member of the Native American Party, and in retaliation, the Native American Party then attacks a home of a man named John Allen. And Allen and his family, his wife, his sister-in-law, their 3 children. They also have 3 enslaved people who are the property of Allen's father-in-law, that is his wife's father, a fellow named George Kilmore. So they're living in this farm on the frontier when they're attacked by this Indian party, and all of them are killed. John Allen shot. His wife, his sister-in-law, the children, the enslaved people, all killed with hatchets and knives and then scalped. And this is a way of raising fear on the frontier that this enemy can come at any time and attack. And then they move on. Now, there is, as I said, a small force still at Fort Edward led by a Lieutenant Tobias Van Vechten. And Van Vechten comes out with about a dozen men to try to counter this big force that's coming after them. And Van Vechten and his men are attacked by the native people. Van Vechten and 7 of his men are all killed and scalped. The others, the wounded, some of them managed to get back and tell the story. So here we know in Fort Edward that the enemy is coming. There's really nothing we can do to defend ourselves. So in this very relatively small settlement at Fort Edward, there is real panic. And in the house where Jane McCrea is staying, Sarah McNeil's house, they try to get into the basement to take refuge. And Jane gets into the basement. The enslaved woman and her daughter get into the basement. And Mrs. McNeil apparently is, she's an older woman. Well, older, I shouldn't say older. She's older than Jane. She's probably in her 50s at this point, 60s. Remember, she's a grandmother. She also is, by all accounts, the accounts we have of her is that she's somewhat short-tempered. Of course, the story I'm about to tell you will indicate why she might be short-tempered. She's a cousin, as I said, of Simon Fraser, the general commanding, one of the generals commanding the British forces. And she's also very fat. She has trouble getting down the ladder into the basement. Okay, so when the Native Americans come into the house, they see this woman stuck basically in the basement door, and they pull her out. And then they look in and they see Jane's bright dress, and they pull her out, and they almost strip both of these women. They don't see the African-American woman and her daughter hiding in the basement, but they do take off Jane and Mrs. McNeil, and they also take a bed and a mirror and some other things from the house. This is a quick raid, and we're just trying to grab some captives as well as some loot and head off. So this Native American party then heads off with their captives. They have a couple of horses, actually the horses that had been saddled earlier to take Jane and Mrs. McNeil to safety. One of the holdups was they were trying to find a side saddle that could accommodate Mrs. McNeil. As I said, she was a rather large woman and so needed a special saddle on the horse, which couldn't be found quickly. And now the Indians, of course, can't get her onto a horse either, but Jane is put on a horse and Mrs. McNeil kind of dragged behind as they head off. So quick raid, bring the captives off, and then we can ransom them or bring them to the British fort where they can be held as hostages and we'll get paid for our troubles. Now, somewhere along the line, Mrs. McNeil and Jane are separated. And at this point, the things become mysterious to us. We don't know exactly what happens. This is the last time Mrs. McNeil saw Jane alive, because sometime after this, Jane is killed. And there are different versions of exactly what happened to Jane McCrea. In version one, the version that becomes very popular in the 19th century, it wasn't a raiding party. It was two emissaries, as I said, sent by her fiance to bring her up to Fort Ticonderoga for their wedding. And these two characters, these two native people, argue about who really is responsible for her. You see, the fact that there are two Native Americans doesn't make sense if the other story is this was a raiding party and somehow Sarah McNeil got separated. And the way the other version explains that is another group of Native people came onto the scene, and then they argued with these two. In any case, in either case, you have an argument among the Native people about this particular captive, Jane McCrea. And somehow in this argument, someone shot her. They shot Jane McCrea, and then they argue about who is not responsible for her death, but who will get credit for having captured her. Thinking is, remember, the British will pay for scalps of the enemy, but there's really no way of verifying who is an enemy if all you have is the scalp. So we've lost the person we're supposed to be bringing back, but we can then argue we have a scalp of someone we killed who was an enemy, and we'll get compensated for that. So we have Jane now dead and scalped. And the Native Party then continues on. And the other Native Party bringing Sarah McNeil up to Fort Ticonderoga is also on its way. And at some point, they do get to Fort Ticonderoga with Sarah McNeil, who's been dragged actually most of this way. And when she gets there, she confronts her cousin, Simon Fraser, and really blasts him for what he is doing. And he thinks maybe she should be sent back to Scotland. Probably just wants to get her away from him because she's making clear what she thinks. She doesn't know, I suspect, what's happened to Jane. Jane never makes it. On the other hand, the native Wyandotte, whose name is Panther or Laluk, comes with Jane's scalp. And her scalp is recognizable. She had really luxuriant hair. Although the sources disagree on what color the hair was. The sources disagree a lot about Jane. In the more romantic telling of the story, Jane McCrea is a beautiful woman, very tall woman, statuesque, notable with striking hair, but it's always of a different color. Sometimes it's black, sometimes it's brown, sometimes it's red. We're not quite sure. But according to the romantic story, her betrothed, David Jones, recognizes her hair and he buys it and keeps it. And every year on the anniversary of her death, that is July 27th, he pulls out her scalp. This may or may not be true. What we know about David Jones is he never does marry, and he becomes, by all accounts, something of a bitter, misanthropic recluse. Now, he might have already been bitter and misanthropic before all of this happened. It certainly would not have helped the situation. So Jane is dead. Her body is lying somewhere in the woods outside of Fort Edward. And Mrs. McNeil is taken up to Fort Ticonderoga, where she's blasting her cousin, Simon Fraser, for what he has done on the frontier. By the way, Polly, the granddaughter, also comes on the scene here. And Simon Fraser wants to send Polly back to Scotland too, but Polly doesn't want to go. And one reason Polly doesn't want to go, of course, is, well, she's engaged to an American who's actually in the New York militia. And according to the story, General Fraser says, Polly, I fear you have a Yankee love, which she does. And there's a lot of romantic elements to this whole story, as you will see, which makes it such a telling thing. Anyway, this is the story as we know it. Jane McCrea dead, and after the natives have retreated, the Fort Edward does send out a scouting party, which buries Lieutenant Van Vechten and Jane McCrea nearby each other near the waterway. And after this, according to the story, the death of Jane McCrea, which actually General Gates, in a message in August to General Burgoyne, accuses him for instigating native people on the frontier. And Burgoyne denies it. Burgoyne denies that he had anything to do with it. In fact, he wants to punish the person responsible for Jane McCrea's death. He pledges he'll have him arrested and tried for murder because he doesn't want to show that he countenances this kind of behavior among his troops. That's what General Burgoyne said he wanted to do, but he very quickly finds out that is not something he can do. He is told by the other British officers, and it's also made clear by the native people, that if you start punishing your Native American allies for doing this kind of thing, they are simply going to desert. And though Burgoyne is trying to keep them under control as warriors, he really needs them as scouts. And so Burgoyne realizes his hands are pretty much tied. He cannot do anything to punish whoever killed Jane McCrea. And by the way, other stories emerge subsequently about how Jane actually was killed. In the 19th century, a story emerges that it wasn't actually the Indians at all who killed her. Instead, it was the American militia party that had come out looking for the Native American raiders. And they had come upon the scene, and they had been they were firing over the heads of the native people because they didn't actually want to kill them. They just wanted to send them away. And in doing this, they shoot the woman on the horse. That is an interesting story. To me, it doesn't make a whole lot of sense. That wouldn't they have seen the woman on the horse and not been shooting over the Indian's head? They're going to hit her. Anyway, that is a story that emerges in the 19th century. You can see this is a story in 1777, of course, and then subsequently it becomes the stuff of legend, the death of Jane McCrea. Now, this also has the effect, according to what historians have said and what was said at the time. The militia, as I said, had been retreating from Fort Edward, and Gates was trying to reconstitute his forces to defend against Burgoyne's invasion. And Burgoyne had issued this proclamation saying, watch out, you don't know what you're in for unless you give up the rebellion. And this, according to some sources, did have the effect of dampening the Americans' enthusiasm for the rebellion. You have a big army coming down, an army allied with native people. You're going to think twice about how much you want to be involved in this. But what seems to have happened in the wake of the raid and the death of Jane McCrea is a rising of New England to repel the invaders. That is, it's after the death of Jane McCrea in July, and then Gates's proclamation, or Gates's argument with General Burgoyne. And by the way, when Gates sent a letter to General Burgoyne, he wasn't only sending it to General Burgoyne, he was sending it to the newspaper so they could publish it, so they could see what Gates is saying. And he is talking about Burgoyne unleashing these raiders on the frontier. And that is something, according to historians as well as contemporaries, that raised the New England militia, which had been holding back from this. It's after this that John Stark of New Hampshire comes back into the fray. And so you do see more militia forces coming. Although I should say Eric Schnitzer, whom we talked to a few weeks ago about Saratoga, and is perhaps the leading authority on the Battle of Saratoga, discounts whether there actually was an increase in the militia forces after the death of Jane McCrea. So after 240 years, it's still something of some great controversy about what exactly this provoked. So you do though have more militia forces, or I should say sufficient militia forces by September, October, first to slow down Burgoyne's advance, and then actually to defeat Burgoyne. So this is what we see happening. And the murder of Jane McCrea, the death of Jane McCrea, may have had that immediate impact, or it might not have, to bring out the New England militia and bring them to impede Burgoyne's retreat back to Canada and forcing him to surrender. So that's perhaps the story. But then the other part of the story is this, that is Jane McCrea's afterlife, after her tragic death. We, as I said, don't know if her fiance did actually bring out her scalp every year and weep over the tragic loss of his beloved. But what we do know is a lot of American writers and artists took to this story, beginning actually in the 1790s and in the first decade of the 19th century. Mercy Otis Warren, the historian of the Revolution, one of the first historians of the Revolution, writes about this story in her book published in 1805, The History of the Rise, Progress, and Termination of the American Revolution. And then off in Europe, Joel Barlow, and Barlow was a poet from Connecticut, a diplomat, interesting character. And he is in Europe for a variety of reasons. And one thing he's doing from that distance is writing an epic poem about America, which he calls the Columbiad. And he was part of a group, called the Hartford Wits. I think it may be a gross exaggeration of the word wit, but they were writers based around Hartford who wrote about all kinds of things. There was a lot of satirical things, but Barlow wants to write an epic poem about America, the Columbiad. And by the way, there was actually a movement at this time to call the United States Columbia in recognition of the fact that we are part of the New World. And in the Columbiad, there's actually a section on Lucinda. Lucinda is the name that Barlow gives to Jane McCrea. And this is another kind of 19th century thing. Good old names like Jane weren't seen as good enough, so you needed something a little more elegant. So Lucinda. And in the story, Lucinda is engaged to a Tory named Hartley. And she is, and again, it tells this story about Hartley sending for her under the escort of these two Native Americans who led Lucinda to her lord again. And two Mohawks met the maid, historians hold, poor human nature, must thy shame be told. So it's a shame of human nature about what happens here. And he describes this scene of these two Native Americans killing Jane McCrea. It's quite a graphic scene. She starts with eyes upturned and fleeting breath. In their raised axes, views her instant death, spreads her white hands to heaven in frantic prayer, then runs to grasp their knees and crouches there. It's a long poem. I'm not going to share more of it with you. And I just hope that, of course, Barlow was a better diplomat than he was a poet. And he's also looking not only to write this, but to illustrate it. And he turns for illustrations first to Robert Fulton. Robert Fulton is also in Europe devising a steam engine. And Fulton is going to oversee the drawings. And Fulton does a drawing of this scene, which he calls the Mohawks. And Barlow is just overcome by this drawing of the Mohawks killing Lucinda or Jane McCrea. He says it's the greatest thing he's ever seen. Then he shows it to Benjamin West, the artist, and West isn't as impressed with it. And Barlow does want Fulton to keep illustrating this because he's going to publish this as a very elegant volume, this wonderful book. And here you have a scene and a lot of other scenes in American history in the volume. But before it's published, Fulton shows his drawing to another artist in Europe, a guy named John Vanderlyn. Vanderlyn's an American in Paris. And if you wanted to be an artist, Paris would be a better place to be than anywhere in America. And Vanderlyn becomes really excited about this scene, and he does a painting of it, a painting he is so proud of. I mean, he initially had said, yeah, I'll help illustrate the volume, but he gives up that idea. He just wants to work on this painting, The Death of Jane McCrea. And he shows it at the Paris Salon in 1804. Actually, the first American painting ever exhibited at the Paris Salon. But Barlow as Fulton are not as pleased with this as Vanderlyn was, although I should say Fulton buys it and he sends it to New York, where for about 40 years it's on exhibit in New York, and then ultimately it's purchased by the Wadsworth Athenaeum in Hartford, where it remains to this day. Now, meanwhile, Fulton's gotten busy with the steamboat. He can't really oversee the illustrations. So the illustrations are taken over by a fellow named Smirk. I don't know why I'm giving you all of this story about this particular book. But this book, the Columbiad, elegant volume, and it would have been on the coffee table if there were coffee tables of every elegant home in the country. And the illustrations really convey the history of the country. So you have this story living on in poetry. And I know you're asking, yeah, well, what about serious history? Well, Washington Irving, in his biography of Washington, George Washington, has this story. And Jared Sparks wrote A Life of Benedict Arnold. He tells this story. So the story of Jane McCrea lives on, so much so that in the area where she lived, she remains something of a cultural figure. So in 1822, when they're digging a canal nearby her grave and the grave of Lieutenant Van Vechten, they decide to exhume her body and bury her in the burying ground near Sarah McNeill. Sarah McNeill had lived into the 1790s and had told this story and other stories. And according to tradition, she freely embellished the stories as she went on. So Jane McCrea's body is exhumed from its initial resting place. In fact, they built a bridge essentially over the site, and Lieutenant Van Vechten is still buried underneath the bridge, if the bridge is still there. So she is then taken to the grave of Sarah McNeill, where she's reinterred again with a Presbyterian funeral. And then 30 years after that, she is exhumed again, and she and Sarah McNeill are both buried at the Union Cemetery between Fort Edward and Hudson Falls. And again, a Presbyterian ceremony. The two bodies, now essentially bones, are reinterred. Although at this point, apparently, someone took Jane McCrea's skull. So the skull disappears. By the way, in the mid-19th century, this was not an unusual thing. There were collectors of skulls, actually often scientists or doctors, and collecting them for scientific purposes, they said. This is remember at a time when phrenology was an international scientific pastime, trying to determine character and psychology through the shape of the head. So Jane McCrea's skull would have been an interesting enough specimen, but it disappears at this time. By the way, in the paintings, you have this murder taking place under a big tree, a big pine tree. And at about this time, mid-19th century, that tree is feeling the effects of age, and ultimately it comes down. But an enterprising fellow who happens to own the site takes the wood and takes it to a sawmill and has it turned into canes and boxes and other things. And each of these things, to show its authenticity, has the scene of the death of Jane McCrae embossed on it or engraved on the wood. And it is a scene taken from the Vanderlyn painting. Someone said that actually the creation of these boxes and canes consumed a substantial grove of pine trees to fill in. Again, think about this. In mid-19th century, Jane McCrae is such a figure that people want to own a tree from the site of her tragic death. And also sometime in the 1850s, another American artist named Asher Durand does a painting of the death of Jane McCrea, somewhat different from the others. And that painting is now at Fort Ticonderoga. So we have Jane McCrea living on long afterward, and which again, somewhat mysterious among historians. Did her death actually cause the raising of the militia? We don't know that, but what we do know is that her death has something to do with ideas about American culture and about the nature of warfare, the horrors of war being brought home in the tragic death of this young woman. And different stories of her have different import. In some, she's a teenager, as I said, in some, she's beautiful. By the way, the only contemporary description we have of her comes from James Wilkinson, an American general. And General Wilkinson said she was kind of plain looking. Now, Wilkinson, later on, he is a figure in Aaron Burr's treason trial. Apparently, he was in the pay of the Spanish, and he was a duplicitous general. I don't know then with how much trust we should put in his judgment on Jane McCrea. Now, in the 20th century, some archaeologists doing some work, a fellow named David Starbuck, who is an archaeologist from, he taught at Plymouth State University in New Hampshire for many years, a very distinguished archaeologist, received permission from descendants of Jane McCrea to exhume the body, that is, descendants from her brothers and sisters. The oldest living descendant, who I think was then in her 90s and would have been a great grand niece of Jane McCrea, gives permission to exhume the bodies, and they do. And they do DNA testing on these two skeletons, and they can determine which bones are which. Many of the hand bones had disappeared, smaller bones had disappeared, but the bigger bones are there. And as I said, Jane McCrea's skull is missing. And perfect match between Sarah McNeill and a great granddaughter of Sarah McNeill as far as the DNA went, and also a match between Jane McCrae and this other descendant. And they also determined that Jane McCrae wasn't a tall, striking woman. She was somewhere between 5'2" and 5'4", which would not have been tall even for the 18th century. And then after this exhumation, the bodies are buried again. This is within the last 10 years, buried with an appropriate Presbyterian burial service. And with that, I hope that Jane McCrea's bones can rest easy, even though her story continues to intrigue us. What exactly happened? Panther, the Wyandotte charged with killing her, said it was an accident, and the body didn't show any signs of gunshot. So we're not quite sure what happened with Jane McCrea. We're not sure if her story inflamed New England and brought out the militia to repel Burgoyne, but her story does illustrate a lot about this time. Think about it. Two of her brothers are in the Continental Militia. Two of her half-brothers, that is, children of her father's second marriage, are loyalists, and her fiancé is a loyalist. And according to the story, her best friend is engaged to a patriot, while her best friend's grandmother is a cousin of the British general invading. All of this complicates our understanding of the Revolution and of what's happening in this tumultuous years between 1776 and 1783 and beyond. And I think what we can say about Joel Barlow and Jared Sparks and Mercy Otis Warren and John Vanderlyn and James Fenimore Cooper also wrote about this story. They're also trying to make sense of what went on and trying to explain it in a way that would make sense for them, just as we try to explain it in a way that makes sense for us. And in doing so, I hope we don't stray too far from the story of Jane McCrea. So thank you. And now we will be piped out on the road to Boston. I want to thank Jonathan Lane and thank our many, many listeners all around the world, folks in Thailand, Finland, the Czech Republic, Uzbekistan, Colchester, Connecticut, Burnsville, Minnesota, Sicklerville, New Jersey, and Dorchester, Massachusetts. Thank you all for listening, and I look forward to talking to you again.